Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced, creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm excited to talk to James Mathias. James is a father of four and partner of one. In his heart, he's an artist, writer, and outlaw. Using his brain, he spends his days debating the attributes of rectangles. By night, he fills his soul, using his hands to grant vibrant life to minuscule soldiers and monsters. James, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited.
As your bio mentions, we're going to talk about painting miniatures.
Yes, it's my favorite subject, actually.
That's wonderful. So, it worked out.
Yes.
I think before we get to, I usually start with the origin question. How did you get to this thing? But I think we need to establish some, as good designers, some definitions before we start. Let's start with the hobby, because I don't think a lot of people are even familiar either with the hobby itself, but then with the sort of the miniature painting culture within it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the hobby itself is kind of this nebulous thing that revolves around, there's a lot of different companies currently that are doing miniatures that you can purchase and paint and build and put into game systems. But I think when people think of the hobby, the main crux of that is going to be Games Workshop, which is a company out of the United Kingdom. And they started way back in the day in the 80s. They saw Dungeons and Dragons as this amazing thing. And so they wanted to make their own copycat thing. And they started doing that. But that's kind of spawned into this world building, enormous empire of plastic. And so almost, I would say 90% of the stuff that I'm doing is from Games Workshop in some form or fashion, just because I think in this hobby, they're doing the best sculpts. They're doing the best quality plastic. It feels, I've painted miniatures from other companies, and I'm not dogging on those other companies, but you can feel the difference in quality. You can feel the difference in sizing and scope and things like that. And you can even feel the difference when you are cleaning the plastic to get it prepared to start painting it. You can feel the differences there too, which is astounding when you think about it, because it's plastic, you would think, right? But it's there's some differences there. So I think most people would define the hobby as an offshoot of the gaming world, right? So you've got the idea of board games and skirmish and war games, and then they have these little plastic miniatures that are abstracted pieces for you to move around on a large board. And in order to put those pieces on the table and feel happy and proud of yourself, you have to build and paint those pieces, because they come unassembled on a sprue, which is basically just a flat piece of plastic that has all the 3D rendered pieces you need to glue together to create the little figure that you're going to eventually paint and put on the table. The hobby encompasses all of it, right? The building, the gaming, the lore side of it, like all of the background of these teams and factions and whatnot, and then the painting. And so I think people in their mind will split this up into different sub-factions inside of the hobby itself. But when somebody says hobby, they typically are referring to Games Workshop and painting miniatures and playing the games and stuff, and the lores as well. I do all of the parts of it. So I listen to a ton of lore while I'm painting. I paint to play the game, but I also paint to kind of push myself and figure out how to get better at painting. So every project that I work on, I'm attempting to improve on the last project that I worked on. So I try new things. I try different techniques. I try different paints. I try different application methods. I try all kinds of different things because I'm still in the learning process. I only started doing this 2 years ago. So I'm still in that experimentation and learning and seeing what's my style. How am I going to approach this stuff?
So now I can safely move on to the official first question. How did you get into this?
Well, I've always been really attracted to the output of miniatures. So in board gaming, they have a lot of miniatures games, and those games, the miniatures like in Risk are a super different quality to the miniatures that you would find in something like a Blood Rage, right? Which I think is probably one of the more popular miniatures games out there. That's a board game first. So you've got this variety of quality, right? But when I started off, I'll back it up a little bit. I've been gaming my whole life, but I started off in the niche gaming sector where it wasn't just a game you could buy like at a Walmart or a Kmart, to age myself. They're games that you have to get from someplace else, from a specialty store or whatever. So Magic the Gathering was my first entrance into that world. And I started playing Magic the Gathering the summer of '93 when it came out. And me and my friend would just buy cards and stack them up as tall as we believe we invented Commander, because we would get a whole stack of cards, whatever we owned, and then just play. And then I started slowly getting into the other offshoots of niche gaming. I started collecting miniatures games. And in 2011, I bought a copy of Space Hulk 3rd Edition, which is a Games Workshop board game about space marines breaching a Space Hulk, which is a spaceship in their lore, and fighting a nest of Tyranids, which are essentially aliens, right, from the movie Alien. And I bought that in 2011, and it sat on my shelf just forever because I was afraid to mess up the miniatures in it, right? Because I knew the stakes were high, that it was a hard to come by game, and there was not a lot of going back if you messed up, and I just wasn't mentally ready for it. And so that just sat on my shelf forever. And then you cut to June 2 years ago, and Leviathan, the newest version of Warhammer 40K's box set, like starter box set, is announced. And I'm talking to my oldest, and I was like, oh man, I think that's so cool. I think that's the coolest thing. And they were like, yeah, that is really cool. I'd love to play that. And then immediately I was like, oh, I'm going to buy it. And so I sat up on Saturday and I purchased it, and it came in the mail, and it was even more intimidating. At this point, I still hadn't glued together Space Hulk. My kid was so into it, and they were like, I'll put Space Hulk together for you. And I was like, okay, yeah, let's just do that. And so we break out the box, and we find out that the game has been a push fit model system. So glue unnecessary. You still needed clippers to get them off the screws or whatever, but there was no glue necessary. And so the whole time from 2011 until, 2 years ago, which was 2023, I could have just put the game together because I was familiar with push fit and I wasn't intimidated by push fit. But and then he ended up putting together all of the models for the Leviathan box set as well. And we played our first game, and I was still hemming and hawing about painting. And I was like, I really like to. I think maybe I could. And then I saw this video by Rob, the Honest Wargamer. He was showing a technique, and he dubbed it slap chop, which is not really what the technique is called in an art sense, but it's just what, he dubbed it this, and then the internet exploded with it. But I saw the video and I thought to myself, oh, I could do that. That's something I could do. And then I could be happy with the results, and I won't feel like I've screwed up my miniatures. And it seems simple on the surface. And so I had this box of miniature, like little terrain pieces, but they're like, you put them on the board and they become objectives for your miniatures to fight over. Right. And I thought, well, I'll build and paint this set of miniatures because it's low stakes. If they turn out badly, no big deal. I could buy another box of them. And also they're just terrain, so it's not a big deal. It's really low stakes. And so I built those, and I was like, oh, this isn't too hard to do, like the gluing and the cutting and the sanding and stuff. And I was like, this is actually kind of fun. So I put those together, and then I primed them, and then I spent the weekend just slap chopping them, right? I dry brushed a bunch of white paint on them really poorly, and then I took colors of speed paints that I had. And this was in August. It was August 5th of 2023. And I just stayed up all night. I was just slapping paint on these things. And they came out okay. They looked pretty good. They weren't bad for a first try, but I loved it so much. Like, I can't tell you like how much I enjoyed just the process, just the taking these little tiny objects and making them something that was real. They'd start off on a sprue all flat and gray, and then you do a series of things, and it takes a long time. It takes a long time to do it, right? And so you you force yourself to slow down. And that's why I fell in love with it, was that. And then for my birthday, my partner Lou, she bought me a set of Army Painter speed paints and a box of Space Marines on motorcycles. And so those were my official first models, right? Were the Space Marines on motorcycles, and I built them, glued them together. But then I was like, oh, I don't know. I can't paint these. I'm going to destroy them. I got nervous again, right? And so it took me from August 5th to September 5th to work up the courage to paint those motorcycles. And what I did in between is I found a box of old board game miniatures from a game called God Tier that I had decided I didn't like, and I was going to sell the game. And then I thought, well, no, this is a perfect opportunity for me to practice and get my confidence up. And so I painted about 6 miniatures from that box, and I ended up giving them away to people in the house. I picked miniatures that I thought they would think were cool. And then I'd sit and I'd paint those slap chop style. And I painted 6 of those. And I was like, you know what? I can do the motorcycles. And then I painted the motorcycles, and I look back at them now 2 years later and I go, oh, those are really bad. But in the moment, I was so proud. I was very proud of what I had accomplished, and I just loved it. And, I go through these little spurts of putting too much on my plate in terms of miniature painting and thinking to myself during the project, I go, this is the one that's going to burn me out. I'm not going to want to do this anymore. But every single time I find, as soon as I finish, like put the final touches on that project, I'm thinking about what's the next one, or I already have the next one on my desk ready to go. And I just go right into it. And in 2 years, I have an unbroken streak minus a month of moving from Memphis to Vermont, because that was just a nightmare. But other than that, I have an unbroken streak of painting every single day. And it's just, it's the most joy that I've felt in a long time. I'm 51 years old, and this is the first hobby I've had where like every part of it just completely enthralls me and I'm passionate about. I have board gaming and yo-yos and other things that I really love doing. But, I take breaks. I take long breaks from them. Like, I can go a month without ever playing a board game. And that's pretty common, right? But then I'll get like, oh, I've got to play a board game. But the miniatures, I think about it all the time. And I do. And I think part of it is I'm actively participating in the making of the thing. And that's really at the core of my being. That's what I like doing is, it's part of the reason I got into design as a profession is I like making things. I like tinkering and figuring out how to go from nothing to something. And the miniatures really are something that allows me to do that.
You mentioned, looking back and saying, oh, these things that I've done 2 years ago, the level of quality or the outcome of painting them pales in comparison to where you are today, your skill today, and it's going to continue improving. What is that journey of skill? What makes the technique you're using today or the approach better than the one you did 2 years ago?
I don't know how to answer like what changed about what I'm doing or how I'm approaching, because I didn't really document that. I know that I went from doing the slap chop very quickly. I went from that like method of here's a white miniature. I've spray painted it white or dry brushed it white, and I'm just putting contrast paints, which are very translucent paints that kind of flow into the recesses and do most of the work for you, to doing a more traditional painting style where you use more opaque paints. All acrylic paints are semi-transparent in a way, but the ones that are not contrast paints are more opaque. And so using those and then using layering as a technique, because what I found is that I want to control more of where the paint goes, and I want to control more of how those paint strokes go onto the model. And you can't really do that with contrast paint as much. There are techniques out there where you can start with contrast paint, but then you end up in a layering phase anyways, where you're putting more coats of paint over the same area, blending, doing all kinds of things to make that area look smoother or more finished to the quality that you would like. I'm in a phase right now where I'm painting a lot of texture onto models. And by texture, I don't mean like physical, like you could feel it, but like visual, okay, this is a cloth cape. How can I make it look more cloth? And some of the ways you would do that is to make it look more matte. So it's not as shiny as like the metals around it. But the way you can do that is with texture, right? And so you paint in almost imperceptible cross hatching. on the highest highlights and whatnot. And then you get this kind of like woven look, or like a piece of armor that's, battle worn. You can put a lot of scratches and dings and dents on there, and you can get, you can be very basic with it where it's just like extra lines in a lighter color, or you can come in with a darker color and then highlight those lines with the lighter color so it looks like an actual divot in the metal. There's varying levels of quality in a miniature. I'm nowhere near like competition painting, but I'm also not a beginner painter anymore, right? So I have to mentally prepare myself for when I go onto Instagram or I go onto TikTok and see other people's painting and going, okay, well, I'm not there, but I can get there. I have faith in myself, but I need more practice. I need, that person's been painting miniatures for 30 years. I've been painting for 2 years. It's the same imposter syndrome that I think we feel in other aspects of our lives, especially people who are highly empathetic and get into design as a career. Is like neurodivergency messes with my brain a lot. And so I try not to put a lot of that on the internet. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll put like in my comment going, not feeling good about this one or whatever. But I try to stay positive about it, because I think that is, back to your question, I think positivity and positive self-talk is much better for the artist's brain than oh, this is not good enough, I'll never be good enough, which is something that we all do, right? But I found, and I wrote a little article about this, I call it the outlaw standard. I found that if I don't set myself up for failure, then I do not fail, even if I did fail, right? Like the outcome maybe is I did fail at what I was trying to do, but I don't feel like I failed, right? Instead, I've reframed it for myself as learning lessons. The outlaw standard is essentially do the best you can in the moment. And I apply that to almost everything I do. I'm not perfect at it because, I'm a human being and I have problems and trauma, and, sometimes I beat myself up more than I should. But when it comes to doing things or trying things, and this is going to contradict what I said earlier about getting into miniatures, but I tend to think to myself, oh, I can do that. And that gets me over that initial hump. But like for the miniatures, it took like me seeing, oh, here's a technique that you can try that to me didn't feel overwhelming, because all of the other videos I'd watched about people painting miniatures, it felt like taking something that like a master painter would do on a canvas and applying it to a 3D object. And I was like, that's nuts. I can't do that. I don't know how to control a brush. But then when I saw that slap chop thing, I was like, oh, I could do that. And then that's all it took for my brain to try. And now here I am 2 years later, and I'm doing the things that I said, there's no way I could do that. And I'm successfully pulling them off, and not in some cases as well. But I also see this room for growth and this potential for the future that I think is really interesting and important. And I encourage anyone who's even slightly interested in this hobby, like even just in the periphery, if you're like, that's really cool, I'd like to try that, just try it. Put paint on a model. You can't ruin the model. I promise you can't ruin it, because even if you get the paint on there and you're like, oh, I hate what this looks like, you tried, and you do it again and you do it again and you do it again. If you want to, you might start doing it and go, oh no, this isn't for me at all. I hate this. Like I had one of my kids, I was like, you want to try this? And they're trying to put together models, and they hated it so much. They're like, I don't want to do this. And so they just play the game with me now, right? Like they like the game part of it, but they don't like the putting them together, the miniatures part. So it's not a hobby for everyone, but I think it's a fun hobby. And if you have interest in it and you want to try it, just try it. That's what I would say to people.
I'm curious to know, how much freedom do you have when you paint a miniature? Because I'm assuming there are some established, based on the lore, there's established like, okay, this army has these kind of colors or this kind of equipment. Between a complete blank slate and a fully prescribed painting schematic, where do you find yourself?
I'm full blown into custom stuff right now. I will say that there are certain projects where I feel pretty strongly that you should adhere to the lore or the box art as much as possible. And for me, those tend to be, if I'm building an army set, the named characters in those So like I painted recently Asmodee from the Dark Angels chapter of the Space Marines. And it's maybe a little bit too much lore for the audience, but the Space Marines are, the bad guys. Everybody likes to say they're the good guys. The weird people like to say they're good guys. But if you read the lore, there are no good guys in Warhammer, right? But the Space Marines are particularly bad. But the Dark Angels are one faction out of 20-ish main factions, and then there's a bunch of little offshoots, right? I think that the lore, I'm going to say real quickly before I keep going, I think the lore is really set up to give you as much creative freedom as you want. But then there's also this rigid standard by which you do not have to be creative if you don't want to. Like if you just want to paint the miniatures and you want to paint them precisely exactly to the standards of their chapter or their faction or their lore, absolutely do that. That is a fun time as well. But if you want to get creative with it, there are no rules and you do not have to follow anything. Dark Angels are normally dark green, and they have specific colors for capes and all of those things. But you do not have to paint the Dark Angels dark green to play Dark Angels on the table. You can make them pink, honestly. You might run into a person in your town who goes, that's not lore accurate. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. So to answer your question briefly, there is no limit. You can be as creative or as reserved as you want to be. I am personally of the mind that most of the time I'll look at the box art and go, that's pretty cool, but what else could we do? And that's where I find myself. So the current project that I'm working on right now, the one that's on my desk right now, and it's due to be done this weekend, is a Stormcast Eternals Spearhead, which is a very small group. It's like 9 models, and you put those on a table to play a version of Age of Sigmar called Spearhead, and it's a very small skirmish battle style. It's a wonderful game if anybody wants to look that up. It's a wonderful game. But the Stormcast Eternals aren't super appealing to me from a painting perspective because they are typically painted in all metallic paint. So they'll be all gold or they'll be all silver with a little bit of cloth here and there. I don't mind painting metallic paints, but usually I feel like a metallic paint is a really good little place to put some contrast or a little pop on the model, not for the whole model. And also painting that much metallic paint is a bummer. So I'm not really drawn to them, but I started thinking about like, what if I just painted them like we paint Space Marines with just a solid color as their armor color, as opposed to metallic, and then just put metallic as the trim or whatever. And that's where my mind started. And now I've ended up on this place with them where they're turning out to be my most popular thing that I put on social media. Everybody's like, oh, I love the color scheme on these. And I think it's just because nobody's painting. I won't say not nobody, because I don't know. There's millions of us out here painting. There might be a bunch of people not on social media painting exactly what I'm painting, but I think they're rare to see Stormcast painted this way. And so I think that's more the popularity behind it than the actual colors that I've chosen. But I don't choose colors like ahead of time. I know that there are people out there who plan out their color schemes perfectly before they start. They open up Photoshop and they start painting in Photoshop, and so they can quickly change and decide what colors. I go, well, what color do I want to start with? I grab that color off the rack and I start putting that paint on the model. And then I go, what's a good color that would go with this? And I think that comes from my design background, because a lot of times, especially when I was working in marketing design, you just kind of start experimenting to see what looks good together is a good starting spot after you have your brief. Not so much anymore with design systems and stuff. Now we have a more rigid thing, but I also think that design system's work has made this much more enjoyable for me because there is no rigidity here. This is actual free expression, right? Like I don't have to follow a style guide. I can just go ahead and start painting. Now, once I have that paint job, now I have a recipe, and that's more like design system stuff, right? So it's interesting to me though, because I think there's real freedom there, but there's also rigidity if you want it. And I tend to just kind of go with whatever my brain is thinking in the time. I have another model lined up for a character from the Salamanders army, which is another Space Marine faction. And I will paint that one as close to the box art as possible because named character. And I think the box art looks pretty cool, but I also don't have a whole army for that. So I could just say, I'm going to make them orange. That'll be fine. And it would be fine. So yeah, my main point is I think that there is no limit to how creative or how rigid you can be in the hobby of painting these miniatures.
You mentioned earlier that you play a lot of board games, and I know you do. And I know that, some of those board games are very abstracted in a sense that you can have a cube that represents a city or a train or an army. So that's already something that's very different from, a miniature game to those games where you're playing at the scale of an individual on the battlefield. Another thing that happens here that is different from those other board games is that you are actively participating in manufacturing some of your play pieces by adding things to them that enhance them or were not created at the factory that manufactured the game. Does this sort of, first of all, the individual scale of the game, but also the fact that you injected something from yourself and helped to make some of the game, does that make this game feel different than those other board games?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can say this definitively because I've had experienced this on the board game front as well. I've redrawn an enormous amount, I think 79 maps for a game called Age of Steam because I didn't like the way the maps looked. And so I was like, I'm going to draw my own maps. And then it just kind of snowballed into getting permission from all these other map designers to redraw their maps. And I'll tell you that Age of Steam I want to be very clear that the newest version of Age of Steam is gorgeous, and there's nothing to fix there. I'm talking about the older versions and before that one existed. But the older versions, when playing them, they were drab and they just didn't feel very fun. And I spent a night and I redrew the administration boards and I redrew the map. And then I had a blast playing the game. It was so much fun. And that's a little bit egocentric, right? Because, I made it better. But I did make it better, but I used my design background to make it better. I made it more playable and usable more than I made it more aesthetically beautiful, right? And so, yeah, I very much feel like, because I've played these miniatures games both with unpainted plastic and with painted plastic, and there is no feeling better than putting a painted plastic army onto the board. Because, you look at it and you go, that's a month of my life, but I had so much fun in that month, right? And now I can use them to beat up this other person's team of miniatures that they spent a month on. And that's just really such a wonderful experience to be able to participate in the manufacturing, to use your term there, of the game itself, right? And then the game you feel more connected to the game just already, right? I had backed a board game a long time ago called Gear and Piston, where you could back it at a level where you could get yourself in the game, like a picture of yourself in the game. And I backed it and I played the game with the designer on Board Game Arena. And it's okay. It's a fine game. It's totally fine. And I had a good time playing with the designer. But then when I got the printed game with my picture in it, then it was a wonderful game. Like, it was so fun because I was in it, right? And other people I knew were in it because, a bunch of my coworkers went on that too. So there is something to that idea of having a hand in making the thing that you're now enjoying with other people. But the miniatures really let you take it to the next level, right? Like I could sit and redraw board game pieces all day long. And I don't think it feels the same as spending time painting the miniatures.
That is awesome. James, where can people find you?
I am chronically online. I'm on almost all social media, aside from Facebook, as J Mathias, Mathias. And then 13 in Roman numerals, so XIII. And then I also am at artisticoutlaw.com. On Blue Sky, it's at artisticoutlaw.com because they let you have your own handle for your thing. But anywhere that doesn't let you have a handle, J Mathias, XIII. I'm pretty friendly. I love answering questions about miniature painting. So if folks reach out to me, I'm happy to answer questions, happy to go into more detail. I'll answer questions about just about anything. I'm a pretty friendly person.
I can attest to that. Thank you for joining us today. That was a wonderful conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Guy. I appreciate it.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.